It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon when my husband, Dan, received unexpected news. He'd been given an opportunity to travel abroad for a week on a business trip. While I knew this was an important part of his career, the idea of being alone in our house for the first time in years filled me with both excitement and nervousness. Dan packed his bags, kissed me goodbye, and left with a smile, assuring me he'd call every night to check in. Suddenly, our house, which was usually warm and full of life, felt strangely empty. The quiet was almost overwhelming. The first 2 days passed without any issues. I spent time catching up on work, watching TV, and going for long walks around the neighborhood to keep my mind occupied. On the third evening, I found myself lounging on the couch with a warm cup of tea when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and a sense of curiosity mixed with a slight unease washed over me. When I opened the door, there stood Mark, Dan's best friend, smiling warmly with a bottle of wine in his hand. "Hey, I was in the area and thought I'd check in on you," he said, a friendly grin on his face. "I know Dan's away, and I figured you might be feeling a bit lonely." Mark and Dan had been friends since their college days, and they'd always had an easygoing bond that felt more like family. We often spent time together as a group, but I hadn't really had much one-on-one interaction with Mark before. He was always around Dan, and we'd never gotten to know each other beyond the surface. "Thank you, Mark, but you didn't have to do that," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He shrugged as if it were no big deal. "Just trying to be a good friend." I didn't think much of it. After all, Mark was almost like family. We sat down, shared a glass of wine, and the conversation flowed with ease. We talked about work, shared friends, and how Dan was adjusting to the overseas trip. I found myself laughing more than I had in a while. Mark was charming, in a way I hadn't noticed before, and his sense of humor caught me off guard. Before I realized it, hours had flown by, and we were still engrossed in conversation. There was something about the way Mark listened. His attention was genuine and unwavering. It was refreshing, almost comforting. I hadn't felt this type of connection in a long time. Then, at some point during the evening, the atmosphere shifted. I noticed Mark looking at me differently, not inappropriately, but with a warmth that felt different. The air between us seemed to change for just a moment. It was fleeting, and neither of us acknowledged it, but it was unmistakable. I quickly brushed it off as my imagination, reminding myself that he was Dan's best friend, and I was Dan's wife. Realizing how late it was, I decided to bring the evening to a close. "It's getting late, Mark. I should probably head to bed." He nodded, standing up. "Thank you for the company," he said with a smile. He didn't hesitate as he left. I closed the door behind him, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that lingered in the air. It wasn't supposed to feel like this, and I didn't know why it did. The next morning, I woke up feeling slightly off balance. The evening with Mark replayed in my mind far more than it should have. I told myself it was nothing, just the result of having company during a time when I was feeling vulnerable with Dan being away. Yet, there was this small, nagging thought that kept resurfacing. Something had shifted between us. I tried to immerse myself in work, pushing those thoughts aside. But they crept back in during mundane moments, when I was brewing coffee or glancing at the couch where Mark and I had sat the night before. It wasn't Mark himself that bothered me. It was the fact that I couldn't stop thinking about him at all. This was someone I had known for years, always just in the background of my life. Why was I suddenly noticing him differently? Later that afternoon, I called my best friend, Lily. She was the one person I knew would listen without judgment. "So, Mark came by last night," I began, trying to keep my tone casual. "Mark? Dan's friend." "What for?" she asked, her curiosity evident. I guess he just wanted to check in on me since Dan's away. He brought some wine, and we talked for a few hours. And? Lily pressed, sensing there was more. I hesitated before answering. I don't know. There was this moment. It wasn't anything specific, but it felt like something. It's hard to explain. Lily paused, then asked, "Did he do anything?" No, he didn't do anything, I said quickly. That's the thing, it wasn't anything, but it felt like something unspoken, like we were aware of something we shouldn't have been. Lily hummed thoughtfully. That's tricky. Maybe it was just the wine talking. Maybe, I replied, though deep down, I wasn't entirely convinced. That evening, as I sat down for dinner, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Mark. Had a great time last night. Hope I wasn't intruding. I stared at the message, unsure how to respond. After typing out a few potential replies, I finally settled on, not at all. It was nice to have company. A few minutes later, his reply came in, glad to hear that. I was thinking of stopping by again tomorrow, if you're free. No pressure. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no, to keep things from getting any more complicated. But another part of me, the part that had been lonely for days, found itself tempted. After all, it was just a friendly visit, right? Sure, tomorrow works, I typed back before I could second-guess myself. The next day passed in a blur of nervous energy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something I couldn't quite control. Was I overthinking things, or was there genuinely something shifting between Mark and me? That evening, Mark showed up again, this time with takeout in hand. We sat at the kitchen table, eating and talking like we had before, but something about it felt different. Every laugh seemed heavier, and every look seemed to carry more weight. There was an energy between us that was undeniable. At one point, I caught Mark staring at me for just a moment too long. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly looked away. Guilt settled over me like a heavy blanket. This is ridiculous, I thought. He's Dan's friend, nothing is going to happen. But the more I tried to convince myself, the harder it was to ignore the pull I felt. Finally, after an evening of skirting around whatever unspoken tension was between us, I found myself asking a question that I hadn't planned. Mark, do you ever wonder what would happen if things were different? If we weren't tied to other people? Mark looked at me, taken aback, but not entirely surprised. There was a pause, and then he spoke, his voice quiet. I've thought about it more than I should. I hadn't expected him to say that. My heart raced as a mix of excitement and panic washed over me. I'm sorry, I stammered. I don't know why I said that. Mark shook his head, his expression soft but serious. Don't apologize. I've felt something too. But I don't want to ruin anything. You and Dan, that's sacred. His words struck me deeply, and it dawned on me just how close we were to crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I nodded, feeling the gravity of the moment. I love Dan, I whispered. Mark leaned back, exhaling deeply. I know, and I respect that. But I won't lie, it's hard being around you. There's a connection here that I can't ignore. We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, both of us grappling with the reality of the situation. We had acknowledged something that neither of us had wanted to, and now there was no going back. Mark stood up to leave. I should go before we make a mistake. I nodded, unable to speak, and watched as he walked out of the door. The house felt emptier than ever, and I was left to face the complicated emotions that swirled within me. I did my best not to get carried away by my excitement, but it happens again. I don't know how to stop myself. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure you subscribe to this channel for more videos. I hope you enjoyed it.